Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the second episode of our summer series, where today I'm very excited to talk with legendary journalist and author Moisés Naím about the rise of authoritarianism.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Moisés Naím is an internationally syndicated columnist and best-selling author of several books, including most recently The Revenge of Power: How Autocrats Are Reinventing Politics for the 21st Century, published in 2023. In the early 1990s, Dr. Naím served as Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry. He was previously a professor of business and economics and dean of IESA, Venezuela's leading business school. He now serves as a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His forthcoming book, Charlatans: How Grifters, Swindlers, and Hucksters Bamboozle the Media, the Markets, and the Masses, is coming out in October 2025. Let's listen to the conversation. All right, welcome everybody. And I'm very excited today to be talking to Moisés Naím, who wrote a extremely important and interesting book that I think I read last year called The Revenge of Power: How Autocrats Are Reinventing Politics for the 21st Century. And we thought it would be a good time, unfortunately in many ways, to bring Moisés on to not only talk about his book, but what has transpired in his mind when looking at authoritarianism and autocrats in the couple years since he's written that book. So, Moisés, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to the conversation.
Hi there. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to the exchange.
So, I just want to kind of start off with talking about your book and what you argue in the book before we get into current politics. And at its core, your book looks at the rising trend of authoritarianism over the past decade or so around the world and the growing threat to democracy. And as you sat down and started thinking about this book and the writing of it, what led you to that? What were you seeing in the wider world that made you say, I've got to write this book?
My most common sentiment and feeling was that I have seen this already in my country, Venezuela, which was the stealthy undermining of democracy and weakening of checks and balances, constraints on total power in the executive branch. So it was very crisp, very clear what happened in Venezuela. And then other countries started discovering the same thing, and notably the United States, where it's quite amazing that one can compare a superpower like the US with a failed country like Venezuela today in many ways. But yes, the process were the same, very similar. Of course, there are context, history, size, influence, international relations. Of course, the differences are clear. But what was very, very surprising was how similar was the process of undermining democracy from within in a very stealthy way.
Yeah, and I think you talk about this in the book, and you focus on, I think, what you're getting at are the three Ps.
Populism, polarization, and post-truth. The three conditions have always existed, but now they have acquired a renewed potency and relevance. Populism, we all know, is trying to divide and conquer and using the old trick of dividing everybody, so you keep power through division. That has always happened, but now it has been amplified by polarization. That has always been part of the story and history, but now, because of the third P, which is the post-truth, it has acquired a potency and capacity to influence, shape outcomes, distribute power. It's quite amazing. So the three Ps are three conditions that have always been part of the human experience, of politics and diplomacy and conflict, but amplified by current conditions, mostly having to do with technologies and disruptive techniques and ways. The post-truth is nothing but old-time way of looking at things and changing with their meaning and making such a confusion that nobody anymore knows who to believe, what is said, what it has never been said, but looks like something that has been part of the story. So that's the
Yeah, and it's just like you said, the technology today and the rise of social media and like getting these post-truth issues and thoughts out in such a more dramatic way than in the past really benefits these wannabe autocrats. But can you explain a little bit, maybe with some examples or some things like that from the book? How do the autocrats use these three Ps? Like, what are some specific, whether or not using them individually or in combination? How are they using these to undermine democracy and gain power?
these are typically leaders that arrive to government through an electoral process that by and large is okay, is legitimate. But then as soon as they are in power, they start undermining checks and balances that define democracy. Democracy is not just what happens at the election every 4 years. Democracy is what happens in between elections, and the daily life, political life, economic life, financial, social lives happen in between elections. But as soon as they get in power, and we saw Chavez did that, and then Trump is also doing that, is identify what are the sources that are constraining, who are the actors that are constraining, limiting its ability to do whatever he wants. And he does that. The reason why they is so generalized has to do with another global trend that has not received sufficient attention. That is government failure. There is a huge literature on market failures when markets don't work as expected and do not fulfill their function. Well, there is not an equivalent volume of studies about governmental failure, governments that fail. And what happens is that, and the irony is that this is a condition now around the world. It's very hard to find a government that is successful, that is celebrated, respected, and it's a fragmentation, polarization are the norm.
So you don't necessarily mean like a failed state government.
No, I even goes as far as saying that the Scandinavian countries that are always at the top of the list of the rankings of democracy and human rights, civility really, are being affected by that. It's very hard to be successful as a government this time. So if you cannot be successful in governing by achieving concrete results, and you're impaired in the way you work, and then you resort on populism, polarization, and post-truth.
Yeah, because you're opening the door to criticism and critique of failure and things like that that open the door.
You cannot deliver, essentially. You cannot deliver, then you have to come up with an alternative to retain power. And the way to retain power is just by deploying the three Ps.
So in your book, which you provide a few examples in your book that you sort of track, but is there one that you found that was more interesting or intriguing than others? I mean, I know you talk about Berlusconi doing this a long time ago and his control of media and things like that, but is there one that stands out?
Well, the United States, by far. But what is amazing, what was surprising as I was researching the book and writing and discussing and debating, is how similar it was among even very different countries.
Yeah.
A lot of the three Ps are showing up in very different places, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the United States. You see the head of state actively limiting capacity of the institutions that are designed by the Constitution to limit power in the executive. Well, undermining that becomes a very important priority for these governments.
So you lived through this in Venezuela, and can you talk a little bit about that? What did this look like in Venezuela when you were there, and how did you see this happening there?
Well, it was the difficulty of executing policies quite amazing. Venezuela, at the time in which I was in government in Venezuela, it was quite amazing to discover how little power I had. I have all kinds of mandates, no resources or institutional support to pursue them. So that was quite something. Actually, that led to another book of mine titled "The End of Power," that essentially looked at how power is obtained, used, and abused, and eventually lost. The conclusion of that book, the main thesis, concluding commentary on that book, is that in the 21st century, power has become easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose. And we're witnessing that around the world, and we see surprises and also disappointments in terms of who controls power.
So your book came out, The Revenge of Power, or the one that we were discussing, came out in 2023. What have you seen since the publication of that? Have things, I assume I know your answer here, but, have things worsened? Have you seen this in more places? Where are we now compared to when you wrote that book?
I will identify two things. One is how generalized this process is. How is this happening in very different geographies, histories? You find a very similar pattern. These autocrats also coordinating and creating mutual support groups and using best practices and autocratic best practices are just part of the story. But of course, no surprise is as big as what's happening in the United States. Who would have said that the United States was in the process of what we're witnessing every day in terms of the attempts to undermine power from within?
And specifically, what gives you the most pause when you look at the Trump administration, the second Trump administration in particular?
The attacks on the legislative branch and how they are ignoring the decisions of the judges, how they are jailing judges, how, founding fathers had a very clear interest in making sure that power would not concentrate, that they were afraid of the monarchy, they were fighting against. And so they designed the three concurrent executive branch, legislative, and judicial. They were very clear that these are equally important, independent, powerful centers. And that is now being under attack by President Trump, who just said that when asked directly if he was going to respect the Constitution, he did not reply.
Yeah, he said, I don't know. Yeah.
That I don't know. That tells you, that soundbite, there is a whole arson.
Yeah, and you mentioned the role of the congressional branch. So, they're not checking the executive branch in this case, the Trump administration, because their party's in power, whether or not it's, with the judges and the Supreme Court or any level of judicial announcements or decisions, but then also with like the dismantling of USAID and these things that Congress created and mandated. They're just kind of allowing for this, destruction of a lot of these things. So, we're seeing it in America, but has it been the case in other countries where you're seeing that this wannabe autocrat is basically hijacking their entire political party? Or is there instances of where a political party that leader will push back? Or is it just kind of that what we're seeing in America, that over the last 10 years, Trump basically has become the Republican Party?
Yeah, it was a hostile takeover of the Republican Party that Trump effectively undertook. So there is all kinds of ways in which democracy is undermined. That includes the abolition or the weakening of the institutions that you mentioned. What's happened. One of the surprises that's happening with Trump execution of its agenda is how cruel it is, how uninformed it is, how careless it is. That has been quite something, because the rest of the world always looked at the United States as a bastion of democracy. And now we're watching as that democracy is being constrained in ways that are unexpected, surprising, and hard to fathom.
Yeah, and we talked about, and we can sort of see the populist nature of Trump's rise, Obviously we understand the polarization in the United States and growing polarization in other countries and what that looks like. But can you dive into a little bit more of the third leg that you talk about with the idea of post-truth and sort of how
Yeah.
that plays, how you've seen it play out in either Venezuela or the other countries you've looked at, or how you're seeing it play out in the United States and why that's so important to the other two parts of it?
Political propaganda is part of politics since time immemorial. The notion that you will disseminate information geared to concentrate, amplify power. So there's nothing new with using communication as a tool of power. What is new is that it has it was in the past, it was centered in political parties, in governments, and so on. Now it is scattered in the web, scattered in social media, scattered in institutional redesigns and demolitions. So post-truth is nothing but political propaganda turbocharged.
Yeah.
That is no longer intermediated by institutions, individuals, movements, but is fragmented. Everybody can be part of this new information. And it's being used quite effectively using the most advanced, sophisticated technologies to create chaos and confusion. And we see examples of that on a daily basis.
Yeah, I would imagine, the notion of echo chambers and the creation of echo chambers, some based on algorithms, some based on self-selection are vastly different than what we saw in the past.
Exactly, and we haven't seen anything yet because with the advanced presence and popularization, widespread adoption of artificial intelligence, is a completely new game in town. That is going to, we don't know exactly how it's going to evolve, but we know that it's going to be huge. It's going to affect all of us. We don't know exactly how, but lives and political systems and politics in general are going to be quite significantly transformed by the advent of artificial intelligence. That, as all new technologies, it has some very positive aspects of almost miraculous,
Yeah.
surprising deliveries. But at the same time, like, it's a double-edged sword, right? It has these magnificent, highly welcome new consequences, but at the same time, it has these malignant forms that for which we don't have any antidote yet.
Yeah, and I can imagine there's gonna be a period of danger before guardrails are installed when you've got things like deep fakes floating around in one echo chamber or the other of a political candidate doing something illegal or saying something about a group, and it's a deep fake created by AI, but you can't tell. And we don't have those guardrails in place yet to debunk those. And, and people are already in their echo chambers and want to believe what's in their echo chambers. And it's going to be a dangerous time period for a bit.
That's exactly right. The only thing I would add is that the guardrails that we will be needing are very different from the guardrails that we had and we still have in some ways. A new form of guardrails has to come about because the old designs of guardrails have shown to be very easy to undermine.
Yeah. And I'm going to get to that in a second. One thing I wanted to ask you before we get to the sort of what do we do or what can we do about this is we've had a spate of elections recently where we've seen some of the anti-Trump incumbent parties that were down in the polls have won surprising elections in places like Canada and Australia and even Albania. And just yesterday in Romania, we saw the sort of anti-Trump candidate come out ahead, which was kind of a surprise. But we've also seen illiberal parties making gains in Germany, the UK, Slovakia, other places as well. So what do you kind of read into this? Does this mean anything that these anti-Trump parties have won? Is it strictly based on like the trade issue right now in this moment, or is it something more positive in terms of a pushback against this sort of right-wing populism
The lesson and the takeaway is that you cannot generalize. And we have been surprised by political outcomes that we thought were impossible. Romania, we just mentioned, is an example. But at the same time, we have had very bad news in other fronts.
Yeah.
And so there is not a commonality in how it happens. There is the general trends that I have outlined, but then there is local circumstances, context, history,
Right.
politics, economics, and so on. So in every country is different. And that is what we're witnessing
Yeah.
now.
So, you mentioned needing new guardrails, and that leads me to sort of my final sort of bigger question here. In your opinion, what are the things we can do to try to push back against this and strengthen democracies moving forward? And are there generalizable things we can do, or general things we can do, or does it depend more on local interests and history and culture and stuff like you mentioned, or is it a combination of both?
Essentially, complacency is the main target to attack complacency is what's killing democracies around the world. Disinformation, misinformation, complacency, disinterest is part of a sad story that has democracy deeply weakened and in some places extinct. I'm not suggesting that everybody has to become a political activist and go in the streets and burn flags and messages and so on. But I am saying that we have a problem with leaders. There's a leadership problem in the world. Big problems with small leaders. But the other, even more worrisome trend is not only have a problem with leaders, but also with followers. We have not asked enough attention and secured enough attention from followers. We have, that is a global trend. People that are not informed, that don't care, they have difficult lives and they don't have time to distracted with politics. But the essence of the story is that democracy, through the traditional channels of participation, is now danger of extinction.
So are you optimistic for the future of democracy at the end of the day, or pessimistic, or just kind of unclear?
You see, I'm a realist because being an optimist or a pessimist is a mood, is a psychological kind of thing, and everybody's mood has to be respected. So pessimism is a sentiment, optimism is a sentiment, realism is a concrete measurement of the reality. So it doesn't matter if I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I am a social scientist and I look at numbers, at statistics, at analytical frameworks that I see what's going on. And at this point, our conversation is just a symptom, or a symbol of that. Just think about what we have just said in this conversation in terms of how gravely ill is the democratic process in some important countries like the United States. That is not optimism or pessimism. That is realism. And it's going to be tested. It's going to be, as we speak, it is being tested in the courts. It's being tested in the political process. Let's see what happens with the midterm elections. And let's see what kinds of circumstances will define politics in the United States and in the world from now on.
Well, I think your term of looking at this from a realist perspective is the best way to end this on, because of the fact that I think that's what actually would get people to be active in fighting for democracy. Because if you're an optimist, you think to yourself, oh, it's going to be okay, I don't have to go out and do anything. If you're a pessimist, you're like, well, no matter what I do, it's going to be bad anyways, so you don't do anything. But if you're a realist, you understand the danger and you know that, you need to be active to take a stand and push for democracy and fight for democracy. So I think that's a good place to stop on. So Moisés, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks again to Moisés for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.